The desert had a way of holding its breath just before trouble showed its face. Heat shimmered over the hard earth, and the wind dragged dry sand across the plain like a warning whispered too late. Far from any town or marked trail, a lone Apache stood on a rocky rise, still as the land itself. His name was Tazakin, a name shaped by storms and silence, a name that carried the weight of survival. He had learned long ago that the desert never showed mercy, only truth. Tazakin had been tracking signs most men would never notice. A bent blade of grass, a scuffed stone, the faint mark of iron dragged across dirt. These signs told him a story that did not sit easy in his chest. Someone had passed through here in fear. Someone weak, someone bound. As the sun climbed higher, the air grew heavy with unease, as if the land itself wished to turn away from what lay ahead. Below the ridge, near a dry wash choked with dead brush, he saw them. A woman, her wrists tied with rough rope, her dress torn and stained with dust. She knelt on the ground, shoulders shaking, trying to shield a small bundle pressed against her chest. The baby made no sound, as if it already understood the danger of noise in a cruel world. The woman's face was pale, but her eyes burned with a fierce light. This was a mother who refused to break, even when the world tried to crush her. Not far from them, 3 men lingered near their horses. Their clothes marked them as drifters and scavengers. The kind drawn to lawless stretches where no one would ask questions later. Their laughter came sharp and careless, cutting through the stillness like broken glass. One of them kicked at the dirt, another checked his rifle, and the third watched the woman with a look that made Tazakin's jaw tighten. These were not men who traveled with honor. They were men who took what they wanted and left nothing behind. Tazakin felt the old pull inside him, the one that had guided his hand in battles past. He had survived wars, betrayals, and the slow dying of his people's way of life. He had learned that stepping into another man's trouble often led to blood and loss. The wise path was silence. The safe path was to turn away. No one had called for him. No promise bound him to these strangers. The desert had taught him that survival sometimes meant walking on. Yet his eyes kept returning to the baby's small hand, barely visible from the cloth that wrapped it. The child's fingers curled and uncurled, searching for something solid in a world already full of threat. Tazakin remembered another time, long ago, when his own mother had stood between danger and those she loved. He remembered her voice, steady even as fear pressed close. That memory stirred like an ember refusing to die. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of sweat, leather, and gun oil. One of the men moved closer to the woman, crouching as if to inspect livestock. She pulled the baby tighter, her back straightening in defiance. Her lips moved, perhaps in prayer, perhaps in promise. Tazakin could not hear her words, but he understood their meaning. She was asking the world for mercy. The world rarely answered. From his place above them, Tazakin weighed his choices. His bow rested against the rock beside him, arrows fletched with care and patience. Also carried a rifle taken years before, a reminder that times had changed whether he wished it or not. Either weapon could end this quickly. Either choice would mark him once more as a man who interfered with fate. He knew that once he acted, there would be no turning back. Blood called for blood. Violence echoed long after the dust settled. The men below began to argue among themselves, their voices rough and impatient. One of them glanced toward the horizon, uneasy, as if sensing unseen eyes. Tazakin lowered himself, becoming part of the stone and shadow. His heart beat slow, controlled, but heavy. This moment would shape more than just the next few breaths. It would decide what kind of man he still was in a world that kept trying to strip him down to nothing. As the sun burned overhead and the desert watched in silence, Tazakin made his decision. He rose just enough to take aim, not yet moving, not yet revealing himself. Below, the woman looked up suddenly, her gaze cutting across the distance, meeting his for a brief, impossible instant. Hope flickered there, fragile and dangerous. The baby stirred. Men turned, alerted by something they could not name. And in that suspended heartbeat, before the desert could exhale again, everything stood on the edge of change. Tazakin's eyes never left the small group below, but his mind began to wander back through years that had led him here. He had grown up along the ridges and canyons of the Southwest, learning the old ways from elders whose voices carried the weight of generations. His father, a man of silence and precision, had taught him to read the land as if it were a story written in stone and wind. Every animal track, every broken branch, every ripple in the sand was a word in a language only patience could understand. Tazikhan had lived by those lessons, and they had kept him alive when so many others had fallen. Yet survival was no shield against memory. He remembered the day the soldiers had come, riding hard across the plains, burning the villages that had sheltered his people for centuries. He had been just a boy, hiding in a cave with his mother and sister while fire and smoke swallowed the homes of his people. His father had fought with the fury of the mountains themselves, and yet he had been taken, dragged into chains that clinked like the death of old dreams. That memory was sharp and constant. It had shaped him into a man who did not move blindly into danger, yet could not ignore it when the innocent were at risk. The woman below him, mother, reminded him of his own kin. There was the same fire in her eyes, the same refusal to break even when the odds were stacked against her. He watched as she shifted slightly, trying to ease the baby's position against her chest. The child stirred again, small fists clenching the cloth that covered its body. Tazikhan felt a tightness in his chest. The desert could be merciless, and yet here was a life that demanded protection. He had faced many battles, but none so personal as the instinct that rose within him now. The men lingered, unaware of the shadow that observed them. One of them, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, spat onto the ground and muttered words Tazikhan could not hear. Another kept checking his rifle, adjusting the sight, the third pacing back and forth as if anxious about time. There was an edge to their movements, a restlessness that spoke of desperation. They were men who thrived on fear, yet fear had begun to creep into their own veins. That gave Tazikhan a moment, though moments in such situations were always fleeting. He recalled the stories the elders told him when he was a boy, tales of warriors who appeared when hope seemed lost, of choices made at the edge of the world that changed destinies. They spoke of courage and of the heavy cost that often followed. Tazikhan had never needed those stories for survival before, but now, with the mother and child beneath him, he understood their weight. Courage was not only in fighting, but in knowing the consequences of every action. Every arrow loosed, every step taken could shape lives beyond measure. The woman whispered again, though no sound reached Tazikhan from this distance. He imagined the words, a prayer, a plea, a promise to her child that she would not fail. Her hands moved slightly, brushing sand from the baby's face. The sun caught the strands of her hair, lighting her features like a portrait of endurance carved by suffering. Tazikhan's fingers brushed the fletching of his arrow. He had faced death in many forms, but nothing had prepared him for the tension that now pressed into his chest, like the desert itself holding its breath. Time slowed in the heat and dust. The men argued louder now, frustrated, their voices carrying a dangerous energy. One gestured toward the woman, pointing at the baby, and Tazikhan felt the familiar cold knot of anger rise within him.
Ow.
These men thrived on fear, but they underestimated the power of quiet strength, of the instinct to protect what was innocent and defenseless. Every motion they made was a gamble, every careless laugh a signal that they were blind to the eyes watching them. Tazikhan remembered the night before he had left his home long ago, when he had sat beneath the stars with his father. The old man had spoken of choices, of moments when life demanded a decision that could not be undone. The land tests you, he had said, not with what it gives, but with what it asks of you. That memory surged now, anchoring him, reminding him that stepping into the unknown was the only way to honor what he valued most. Below, the woman shifted again, trying to make herself smaller, trying to disappear in the brush and shadow. Tazikhan could see the fear, the exhaustion, and the fierce determination all at once. She was not a helpless figure. She carried the strength of survival in every line of her face, and that strength called to the Apache in a way no other life had. He had fought for his people, he had hunted across canyons, he had survived storms and ambushes. Yet here, in the heart of this moment, he felt the weight of choice more acutely than ever. A sudden movement from the men drew his attention sharply. One reached for a rope, another took a step closer. The baby stirred again, and the mother's head jerked up, eyes widening with alarm. Tazikhan's hand tightened around his bow, arrow nocked but not yet loosed. The air was thick with tension, charged with the promise of violence and the threat of innocence in peril. He inhaled slowly, letting the desert wind fill his lungs, and felt the weight of every story, every lesson, every memory settle on his shoulders. The world had shown him cruelty before. Yes. It had demanded everything from those who were too small to fight. Back. And now, as the sun climbed higher and the shadow of danger grew longer, Tazikhan knew that a decision was upon him, one that could not be postponed. Yet even as he prepared to act, a sound carried across the plain, low and distant, like the echo of a threat he had not anticipated. The mother froze, clutching her child tighter. The men stiffened, their attention pulled in another direction. And Tazikhan, hidden above them, realized that whatever choice he made, the danger was far from over. The moment hung between them, fragile and sharp, and the desert waited to see which life would bend and which would break. Tazikhan's eyes never left the mother and child, but his mind began to track the movements of the men below. The tallest of them, a man with the scar down his cheek, was circling now, trying to find the best angle, his gaze sharp and calculating. He carried a small knife in his belt, the kind meant for work, but capable of harm. The other two lingered, restless and uneasy, their voices low but edged with menace. Asakin could feel the tension vibrating through the earth beneath him. At every shift of weight, every careless movement was a message, and he read it like a page in an old story. The mother, whose name he would only know later as Nayeli, did not panic outwardly. She pressed the baby close, whispering words that Tazikhan could not hear but understood. Her lips formed prayers to unseen forces, and her hands, though bound, moved with precision, soothing, adjusting. Holding the child in a way that said she refused to give up, she was not naive. She had seen cruelty before, yet she radiated a quiet strength that drew him, not unlike the way a river pulls water into its current. From above, Tazikhan considered his options. A direct attack might save them quickly, but would risk exposure, and the men were unpredictable. They were men who knew violence and chaos, men who could turn on each other as easily as on their prey. He noticed a small pile of rocks near the wash that could be used to create a diversion. If thrown carefully, it might startle the men and draw them away from the mother long enough for him to act. Yet even the smallest plan carried danger. The desert was generous with nothing, and every second of hesitation increased the risk to those he sought to protect. Nayeli shifted slightly, straining against her bonds. The rope cut into her wrists, and Tazikhan saw the fire in her eyes flare stronger. She was not only fighting for the child but for her own dignity, her refusal to be cowed. The baby's tiny cries, muffled by the cloth she held over its face, made his heart tighten. He remembered nights as a boy when his sister had cried for food, for comfort, for protection, and he had been powerless to reach her. That memory surged like a wave. He would not feel that helpless again, not here, not now. The men, unaware of his observation, began to argue more openly. The scar-faced man cursed under his breath, impatient, while another argued about taking the child or leaving it. Their voices rose and fell, carrying the tension like a drumbeat that echoed in Tazikhan's chest. I understood that fear and greed were potent weapons, and that they were now turning on each other as much as on their victims. Every second he watched, he learned, and every second he learned, he weighed the risk of moving too soon. From a different angle, the desert itself seemed to conspire. A sudden gust of wind rattled the brush, lifting dust and sending it swirling like smoke across the wash. Nayeli flinched, her eyes scanning for threats beyond the men, while the men squinted, unsettled by the shifting visibility. Tazikhan saw an opportunity, small but critical. If he could manipulate the terrain, even briefly, he might gain a moment of surprise. Yet the desert's favor was fleeting. A misstep could reveal him just as easily. Memories of his father's lessons returned with sharp clarity. "The land watches," his father had said. "It will give you a chance, but it will not wait for you." Tazikhan's hands brushed his weapons, feeling the familiar weight of both bow and rifle. Neither promised safety, only control. The choice was his, and yet the longer he waited, the tighter the noose seemed to tighten around the mother and child. Neely's eyes darted toward the distant ridge, where the wind bent the tall grass in patterns only he could interpret. She did not know him yet, but somehow she felt the presence of someone who could alter her fate. Her mind raced, balancing hope against despair. She thought of the life she wanted for her child, a life free from fear, and of the man she had briefly seen from the corner of her eye, shadowed against the rocks. Perhaps it was instinct, or perhaps the desert had its own way of drawing allies into impossible moments. The scar-faced man moved closer, crouching low, scanning the area. His knife glinted in the sun. Tazakin's muscles coiled like the bowstring, ready, yet he did not act. The other two men argued, their voices rising and falling, one gesturing toward the mother, the other toward the horizon. They were fracturing, and that gave Tazakan insight. Fear made them predictable, and he had studied predictability in men and animals alike for decades. Yet even with advantage, the wrong move could mean disaster. Suddenly, Nael's baby stirred more violently, a soft cry escaping its lips. Her head snapped toward the sound, and Tazakan saw her lips pressed together in a silent vow. The men's heads turned at the noise, their attention snapping like a drawn wire. For a moment, the desert held its breath, the heat shimmering over sand and stone, the tension thick enough to taste. Every figure below seemed frozen, caught between action and hesitation. Tazakan thought of the canyon where he had learned to survive, where ambushes had tested his patience and resolve. He knew that control did not come from force alone. It came from understanding the fear in others, the patterns in chaos, the faintest whispers of instinct that guided life and death. He calculated, shifted slightly, testing angles, planning the moment when the desert and his decisions might align. Yet even as he prepared, he knew there were unknowns. What if other dangers lurked beyond the ridge? What if Naeli's captors were only part of a larger threat? The desert was rarely as simple as it appeared, and he had learned to respect its hidden depths. Every heartbeat, every movement, carried stakes he could not fully measure. The scar-faced man muttered again, louder this time, and the other two men stiffened. Naeli pressed the baby tighter, rocking it gently, her eyes scanning the horizon. Tazakin's hand tightened around the bow. The desert stretched before him, endless and indifferent, yet here it was, bending time and space into a single pulse of decision. He could see the edge of chaos, could feel the moment approaching. The conflict was no longer just about survival. It was about choice, courage, and the faintest glimmer of hope in a world that had forgotten mercy. And in that suspended instant, as wind lifted sand and tension rose like a tide, Tazakan understood that the coming moments would shape not only his fate, but theirs as well. The decision was near, but the desert held its secrets tight, and the outcome remained hidden, waiting for the hand that would dare to reach into the storm. Tazakan's muscles were taut, coiled like the bowstring he held, every sense alert to the slightest movement below. The wind shifted again, carrying dust and the sharp scent of sweat, leather, and fear. Naeli's small figure huddled with the baby, her eyes scanning, her lips moving in quiet murmurs that spoke of courage and desperation. Every second stretched into eternity. The men, still arguing and distracted by the child's small cry, had not yet noticed the shadow above them. Tazakan knew he had only moments before their vigilance sharpened. The scar-faced man suddenly kicked at a rock, sending it skittering across the dirt. Heli's head snapped up instinctively, and her eyes met Tazakin's for the briefest instant. In that look, he saw something that anchored him, not just fear, but hope. That tiny spark was fragile, but it burned bright. He felt the weight of responsibility settle heavier on his shoulders, could not allow it to die. The second man, wiry and restless, began pacing closer, muttering under his breath. Tazakan noted the patterns, every step predictable, every glance revealing weakness. These were men accustomed to taking what they wanted, never planning for the possibility of being outwitted. Yet even the best of plans carried danger, and Tazakan could not ignore the randomness of fate. A single wrong move, a misstep in timing, and everything could collapse in an instant. Naeli shifted again, attempting to loosen her bindings with careful hands. She gritted her teeth, sweat mixing with dirt on her palms. Tazakan felt a surge of admiration. She was no helpless figure. Every motion, every breath, spoke of determination and instinct. He realized that she had been fighting as long as she had known fear, and that made the risk of failure even more unacceptable. Her courage was contagious, anchoring his resolve even as tension coiled in his chest. The third man, short and stocky, began rifling through a pack at his feet, tossing aside blankets and supplies. Tazakan saw an opportunity in the distraction, could move, strike, or create a diversion. Yet he paused, weighing the potential chaos. The desert had taught him patience. Impulse led to ruin. Timing, precision, and understanding of fear and instinct were the only ways to turn the tide without unnecessary loss. A sudden caw of a raven echoed from a nearby cliff, and the men stiffened, their attention pulled skyward. Tazakin's pulse steadied. The moment was fleeting, but it existed. He shifted slightly, arrow knocked, eyes calculating. The landscape around him seemed to lean into the tension. The brush bending in invisible currents, the sun glinting harshly against rock and sand. He could feel the heartbeat of the desert in sync with his own, a rhythm that demanded action. Nayeli whispered again, her voice low but determined. The baby squirmed, tiny fists pressing against her chest. Tazakan imagined the words she spoke, a promise to survive, to protect, to endure. Every fiber of her being radiated urgency and courage. He felt an odd kinship forming, a silent understanding that their fates were now intertwined. Whatever he did next would not just decide life or death, it would define the future for both mother and child. The scar-faced man lunged suddenly toward Nayeli, his knife glinting in the sun. She reacted instantly, shifting her body to shield the baby, and the moment stretched, frozen in time. Tazakan's bowstring creaked as he drew, every arrow poised like a heartbeat. The desert seemed to hold its breath alongside him, the wind stilling, the dust suspended in golden light. He knew the smallest delay could undo everything he had planned. The wiry man stumbled, stepping on loose rock, sending it tumbling near the woman. She flinched, but remained steady, clutching her child closer. Tazakan noted the chaos. Every movement, every falter, was an opportunity if he struck with precision. The desert had trained him for moments like this, where instinct and observation were the only guides. Every decision carried weight, every second demanded focus, and yet the risk of error was ever present. Nayeli's eyes scanned desperately, her gaze shifting to the horizon as though looking for a miracle. She whispered again, her voice stronger now, filled with determination that seemed to ripple across the earth to Tazakan. He felt a surge of urgency. The child stirred again, a soft wail, and the men reacted simultaneously, voices rising. Confusion and tension mixing in the hot air. The desert had become a stage for fear and courage, and Tazakan was both spectator and actor in this unfolding drama. The scar-faced man's knife glinted once more as he took a cautious step closer. His attention split between Nayeli and the falling rock. The wiry man's hand went to his rifle, checking its readiness. The stocky man cursed, fumbling with the pack, still oblivious to the arrow hovering in the distance. Tazakan's mind raced, calculating trajectories, timing, wind, distance. The desert seemed to amplify the intensity of each heartbeat, each movement, each decision. Tazakan shifted slightly, ready to act, but the moment stretched. Nayeli whispered again, a wordless promise, and the baby stirred once more, tiny fists clutching at the cloth. He felt the invisible thread that bound their fates tighten. The men were distracted, fractured by their own greed and fear. Every second heightened the stakes. Every second pulled the tension tighter. The wind picked up again, lifting dust and dry leaves, masking movement. The scar-faced man's eyes flicked to the ridge, sensing something yet unsure. Nayeli's head darted toward the same ridge, and the baby's wail rose, a fragile, urgent sound. Tazakan's arrow was poised, his senses razor-sharp, every fiber of his being ready. The desert seemed to pause, as though waiting to witness the outcome of a single, crucial decision. Time condensed, the horizon burning gold, the wind carrying whispers of danger. Tazakan knew the coming moments would demand everything he had learned, everything he had survived. Every movement, every breath, every decision would carry consequences far beyond the wash where fear and courage now collided. The climax of this confrontation was near, and every heartbeat rang with anticipation, the world itself trembling with the suspense that had drawn them all together. And in that suspended moment, as the sun climbed higher and shadows stretched long across the rocks, Tazakan prepared to act. Yet the desert, the men, and the fragile mother and child held their breath with him. Every eye, every nerve, every heartbeat aligned for the instant before the storm of action. The instant where courage and choice would collide with fate, and the outcome remained hidden, suspended on the edge of destiny. Tazikhan held his breath, every muscle coiled, as the scar-faced man took another step toward Nayeli. The wiry man's hand hovered over his rifle, the stocky man fumbling with his pack. The desert seemed to pause, the heat rippling off the rocks, every sound amplified in the silence of anticipation. Then, with a movement as fluid as the wind itself, Tazikhan released the arrow. It sailed straight and true, not to harm, but to strike the ground just behind the men, sending a shower of dust and small rocks into their faces. They yelped and stumbled, startled by the sudden noise, their attention ripped from Nayeli and the baby. In that instant, Tazikhan dropped from his perch, moving like a shadow along the ridge, silent, swift, and precise. He landed behind a cluster of boulders, within striking distance of the trio, and the desert swallowed his steps. Nahel's eyes widened as she saw the figure moving toward them, but she sensed no danger from him. There was an unspoken understanding, a recognition of a protector, a guardian, who had come when all hope seemed thin. Her small voice whispered the baby's name, and the child stirred, safe for the moment in her arms. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly, though her pulse remained quick. The men scrambled, confused and frightened. The scar-faced man cursed, raising his knife, but Tazikhan was faster. With careful precision, he disarmed him, using leverage and skill rather than brute force. The wiry man, in a panic, tried to raise his rifle, but Tazikhan's swift movement and calculated shove sent him sprawling into the sand. The stocky man froze, indecision paralyzing him, and in that instant, Tazikhan stepped forward, his presence commanding. "You will leave," he said in a low, steady voice that carried over the dust and rocks, "and you will never return to this place." His eyes, dark and unwavering, held the weight of a man who had survived storms, wars, and cruelty. The men, recognizing the danger they had underestimated, scrambled toward their horses, muttering threats that meant nothing now. Tazikhan's bow remained ready, a silent warning, and the trio fled, leaving nothing but footprints and unsettled dust behind. Nayeli lowered the baby, gently cradling it as she stood. Her hands were trembling, but her face held a fierce gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying through the still air. I thought it was over." Tazikhan nodded, keeping a careful eye on the retreating men. "It is not over until you are safe," he replied. "The desert is full of dangers, but you are stronger than you know." For a moment, they stood together in the wash, the baby sleeping quietly in Naila's arms, the desert sun painting golden light across the rocks and sand. Tazikhan lowered his weapons, the tension in his muscles easing, though his mind remained alert. "You should move," he said, "far from this place. The wind carries news faster than men think." Naili nodded, understanding the warning. She tied the baby securely, adjusting her dress and bindings with careful hands, ready to continue their journey. As they began walking toward a distant ridge, the sun sinking low and painting the desert in warm shades of orange and red, Tsakan stayed just behind, a silent shadow guiding their steps. Naili glanced back once, gratitude in her eyes, and Tsakan gave a small, solemn nod. There were no words necessary. Survival, courage, and trust had spoken louder than any speech could. On the way, Naili shared fragments of her story. How she had fled a settlement under threat, how she had hidden the baby and tried to survive. Tazikhan listened, never interrupting, his presence both a shield and a silent reassurance. He understood the depth of her fear, the weight of every choice she had made, and the strength it took to continue, despite the odds. In return, he shared little, only enough to build trust, stories of survival, of the land, and of the old ways that had guided him through decades of hardship. As night fell, they made camp beneath a rocky outcrop, the baby resting safely between them. The stars began to pierce the sky, endless and unwavering, like old witnesses to human courage. Ayeli looked at Tazikhan and asked softly, "Why did you help me?" He stared at the fire, letting the flames dance across his face before answering. "Because no life should be taken when it can be saved," he said simply. "Because the desert remembers those who act with courage and mercy, and because you would not give up, even when fear whispered that you should." The baby stirred and made a soft sound, and Naeli smiled, exhaustion and relief etched in her features. Tazikon watched them, feeling the rare, quiet satisfaction of knowing he had made the right choice. The desert was still vast, still dangerous, but for now, the threat had passed. The mother and child would survive, carrying with them the courage and strength that had drawn him to intervene. In the quiet of the desert night, the three of them rested. Tazakin, ever vigilant, allowed himself a small breath of relief, knowing the immediate danger was behind them. Nayeli, holding her child close, felt a warmth that was more than the firelight, a sense of hope, of protection, and of human courage that could overcome even the most desperate circumstances. The desert would continue to test them, but they had faced the worst and survived. The sun would rise again, painting the rocks and sand in golden light, and they would move forward, stronger and more determined than before. Tazikon, Nayeli, and the child had formed a bond, forged in fear, courage, and shared resolve. It was a reminder that even in the harshest places, life could endure, hope could thrive, and courage could prevail. As the stars blazed above, and the wind whispered through the canyons, Tazikon finally allowed himself to relax. The immediate danger had passed, the men were gone, and the mother and child were safe. The desert, vast and indifferent, had witnessed their courage. And in that witness, there was a quiet promise that even in a world full of shadows, light could be found in the strength of the human spirit, in acts of bravery, and in choices made to protect life against all odds. Nayeli rested her head against the boulder, the baby sleeping peacefully. Tazikon gazed at the horizon, the faint glow of dawn, promising a new day. The story of survival, of courage, of humanity had reached a turning point. They had faced fear and danger, yet together they had endured. And in the quiet desert night there was a sense of peace, a feeling that even in a harsh and unforgiving world, good choices and bravery could bring hope and a future worth living for.